It's time for 7-8 history recorded lesson during the coronavirus outbreak. We have watched over 5 episodes of Ken Burns' The Vietnam War. Be curious what you think about it so far. We haven't given an honest evaluation. Honestly, any documentary is kind of fun to watch, maybe more than just reading a book. You may be a little shocked at how intense it can get. I know I've really mentioned that a lot. I think to a point that's okay because it was an intense war and that's how history really was. I apologize for the times that maybe it takes you even further than it maybe needs to. This is actually the 12th slide. We're going to start at slide 1. But by editing around it, it is a useful documentary for us to watch. His Civil War one maybe is more appropriate toward grade school, and there are other Vietnam War documentaries out there we maybe could have watched, but this one is readily accessible. It was brand new just a couple years ago when I started teaching this, and there aren't as many documentaries as you might expect for a war like this one, nor as many veterans going out and speaking about it because it is recent. We're still trying to figure out how we feel about it, and it can take several decades to establish faithful history about something, and not a lot of filmmakers have had a chance to put something like this together. So a 10 episode intense in-depth look at this war about 50 years ago is kind of a rarity, and I think it is useful to see, not just read what's happening. I'm going way back. The first episode was called Deja Vu. I wonder if you can guess why they called it that. But just like our textbook, which you read chapter 29, lesson 1, starting at page 874 today, both of them started with not the conflict with America, but Vietnam's conflict with France, because they considered it their colony along with Cambodia and Laos. They called it French Indochina. And Ho Chi Minh, a guy you hear a lot about, I'll abbreviate it HCM, he was a gentleman who opposed rule by a foreign country, first France, and later he would oppose America intervening, and in between there Japan. And he found that the best way to do that was to adopt communist principles, or at least that's what he believed in. Now, he hoped that when they fought France to become independent, he actually went to the U.S. not as an enemy, but for assistance. Now, do you have any guess as to why he did that, or do you remember from the video? It's kind of hard to imagine now that you know this much about the war. But Ho Chi Minh was hoping we would see ourselves in their fight like we fought for independence against Great Britain. But the U.S. didn't think that way. And why? Communism is dangerous, right? The conflicts between, for example, us and the Soviet Union arose from very different economic and political ideas. Ours, capitalism and democracy. Theirs, kind of all wrapped up into what we call communism. The Soviets hoped to spread it around the world. We saw ourselves instead as the spreader of something else. That comes of freedom. That comes from actually your textbook, page 800. What is it? Trying to sort out what's the difference. Communism requires great trust that other human beings are going to be fair to each other and they're going to do the right thing. All right? You might not have a whole big problem with that, but you might have a problem with this. Communism advocates for the destruction of religion, including Christianity. Just listen to Vladimir Lenin, an important founding father of the Soviet Union and communism there. Atheism is a natural and inseparable part of Marxism, which was a base philosophy to communism. Of the theory and practice of scientific socialism, another theory that very intimately ties into what we call communism, or life as a commune, where you have to all get along and share. So we consider those types of ideals as hostile to the American way, hostile to freedom, hostile to Christianity, and we fear that that type of thing will only spread if it's tolerated. I want you to be considering throughout our time in the textbook on the Vietnam War, overall the big idea, should the U.S. get involved in foreign problems, foreign affairs, such as a Vietnam, such as earlier a Korea, such as Iraq, Afghanistan, overseas issues. There's no right answer to that, but I think you become more knowledgeable on a debate like that by understanding in depth a war like this one. Who's this pictured? That's Ho Chi Minh. We talked about how he led the fight to overthrow rulers like France when they were French Indochina. He and France disagreed, on just a little thing in 1945 called "We're independent," and France says they're not. A pretty big thing to disagree on. See, what was 1945? It's the year that World War II ended. And in the wake of the war, everyone kind of picks up the pieces. Vietnam now thinks of themselves as free from Japan, who had been ruling them since France had left. France comes back and says, now Japan's gone, we are going to take over again. So Ho Chi Minh mobilizes to prevent that, along with his Viet Minh, Vietnamese nationalist forces, sort of the early Viet Cong. Meanwhile, there's what we call the domino theory. What was it? Whose administration do we hear at the beginning of our lesson in connection with the domino theory? The domino theory was the fear that one country turning communism turns every neighboring country into communism. The administration, President Eisenhower, about 6-7 years after World War II, coined that idea and acted anti-communist because of, not just because they didn't like the communism there, but they feared it would threaten democracy throughout the world, and we were the beacon of freedom, right? The Viet Minh's style of fighting in the book is considered hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. When you talk about them being guerrillas, it means they don't fight traditionally. They fight where they strike, and they leave, and they use their environment to hide and be effective. The Geneva Accords, named after Geneva, Switzerland, was a meeting where they, for all intents and purposes, divided Vietnam. It used to be a single country. It is again, but at this time they divided it in half because that was all the rage back then, right? You divide Germany in half, you divide Korea in half, let's divide Vietnam in half. It was a big compromise time of history. Let's not decide if it's one or the other. Let's cut it in half and worry about it later. Talked about the domino theory. This is a GIF that animates the spread of communism from the 30s into 2017, and you see how suddenly it all drops off because the USSR collapses after the fall of communism. So it did spread almost like a domino, maybe not as predictably as you would think, but the communist world reached its peak in the 70s and 80s, where you could have argued, if we watch this one more time, that almost half the world, if you look at the way that it colored Africa and Europe and the way USSR had grown, look at that, right? That's what all the fuss was about. Maybe more like a third of the world, but still to think that the third of the world had turned to communism is a little bit jaw-dropping, and to not know where it was going, it was scary to the United States. They didn't like what it was doing to people and what it was doing to the world. Unfortunately, the government that did get propped up in South Vietnam, as you learned from the video under GM here, was not really any better. We supported him because he was anti-communist, but that was all he had going for him. Really, we had to turn and look the other way at the fact how brutal, dishonest, violent, controlling, and what we might call nepotistic his regime was in South Vietnam. It was considered a republic. It was technically democratic, but he was the most dictator democratic leader I've ever really learned about. Nepotistic means he would favor family members. He wouldn't make them deal with the same hardships. Maybe they didn't have to deploy as soldiers, or they would be given government positions just because they were related, and that's not a good thing. Not in democracy, at least. Governments of North and South were set up differently after the war, different global wars, in that the North, kind of like in Korea, was set up as communist, and the South democratic. But that wasn't all the work of the USSR. As we learned, Ho Chi Minh had turned to communism on his own. What do you think life in Vietnam had been like before they divided it? It's not something we talk a lot about. Something to think about. And what do you think caused life in the North to actually be better? You can find some of that page 876, where they talk a little bit about what kind of a leader Ho Chi Minh was, and the quote, and how the people up in North Vietnam, they didn't necessarily feel enslaved by a communist dictator. Ho Chi Minh wasn't exactly a Joseph Stalin. or a fascist leader. He for a lot of reasons, inspired support, though he did stage violent crusades against like the landowners, like they mentioned in the book. So as one of the 2 comments I'd like for you to leave on this presentation in Classroom, if it works, it'd be wonderful to see you answer this bullet. What do you think caused life in the North to be better, much better, it said, than in the South? Why was GM's government unpopular? Well, first of all, see the second bullet point. It was brutal. It was dishonest. It favored his family, controlled people, didn't give freedoms the way it should as a democracy. It also treated the Viet Minh's supporters fiercely, right? It didn't feel like you had freedom to support whom you wanted the way that America did. So it was a faulty version of democracy. This is an album cover for a band. If the picture might look familiar, it's kind of a famous one. Think about, what is that a picture of? First of all, GM in the South, his army, we call ARVN in the video. ARVN is a short version of saying Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And you can see why they didn't want to say that every time. By the end of 1960, that year, how many U.S. military advisors were stationed? In 1960, it was still only about 900, which to them was a lot at the time. Notice we didn't have troops, not even air or Navy support. It was just advisors assisting, telling them how to fight. Think picture at the bottom of 876. Then, just 3 years later, still under Kennedy's administration, 16,000. So quite the increase, and it just continues to increase from there. How did South Vietnamese citizens respond? The National Liberation Front, or the NLF, is mentioned at the bottom of page 876, a group that fought against GM's government and, by relation, the U.S. advisors being there. So they were our enemy. The Buddhist monks protested non-violently, except if you count themselves. That's what this picture is, a monk burning themselves, lighting them on fire. It's a remarkable thing that really happened. And finally, the response, what we call a military coup, which basically means a rebellion, a mutiny against the ruler, staged by the military there. In November 1963, they kill GM, finally, in discontent, and take over. But unfortunately for South Vietnam and us, life only got worse. Let's wrap up with more talks about episode 2, the one we called Riding the Tiger of the documentary. That comes from a quote by Kennedy. In response to the communist challenge posed in South Vietnam, Kennedy rejected sending ground troops right away. That took time. Instead, he supported what's called a limited war strategy to confront and contain the threat of communism. Tactics used in such a limited war, different from what we think of as conventional war. The U.S. military undertook little revision of traditional strategy because U.S. superiority seemed so overwhelming. To keep their casualties down, the U.S. initiated massive bombing. Okay? They just bombed more in 1 year. Finally, if we move ahead to 1967, that was then in all of World War II combined in just 1 year. Just dropping napalm and bombs. Operation Rolling Thunder, right? We'll learn about that next lesson. The civilian casualties were estimated at not just 1,000, but 1,000 a week when the heavy bombing was occurring, a figure that was kept secret from the American public. The U.S. introduced the use of defoliants like napalm, which is a jellied gasoline flammable. One bomber group's slogan was, "Only you can prevent forests." Kind of a play on Smokey the Bear's advice. During the war, about half of Vietnamese rainforests were destroyed. So many human and civilian casualties, military casualties, but we don't want to completely forget the toll it took on the world and the landscape and God's creation itself. By 1967, all major military targets had been destroyed. There were 500,000 troops stationed in Vietnam. And we were spending $2 billion a month on this war. No evidence that the North Vietnamese were weakening. In fact, the bombings, the destruction of fields and crops were a problem in that they increased support for the enemy. Both the National Liberation Force and the army that they put up and supported, these guerrilla sort of independent mercenaries called Viet Cong or VC. Limited war, Americans will sometimes argue, well, we could have won if, for example, Ronald Reagan said, if we hadn't used this limited war strategy of Kennedy's and just made a wholesale commitment right away, we would have won. But because it was dragged out and we were reluctant to get involved early, we weren't able to win. Here's my second question. Besides the first one, in your comment, would you add, what do you think of Reagan's opinion? Should we have gotten more involved right off the bat? We'll talk more about limited war at the beginning, actually really for the theme of Monday's class. In the meantime, you've got these two comments and then a Google quiz posted for you to complete before Monday's class. Thank you for listening. Time to close out. See how we get this. All right, have a good day.